today. The MOEX is down double digits, down aggressively. The lending costs for the Russian state are up aggressively to the highest levels since 2016. Do any of the economic or potential sanctions impacts have any bearing on what Mr. Putin does? Or actually, is he averse to all of those moves?
Yeah, look, this is obviously a difficult one to answer, because I think up to yesterday there was an assumption that Russia would restrain its actions because it would not want to be subject to the so-called sanctions from hell that have been talked about in Washington and European capitals. But clearly that hasn't happened. The assumption now is, of course, absolutely that US, Europe, UK will impose much more damaging sanctions, more damaging than the ones we've seen earlier this week, which were relatively mild, but we will get additional damaging sanctions. And the assumption is that how bad they are may be conditional on what Russia does next. In other words, perhaps using them as an additional continuing threat to try and persuade Russia to limit its actions and go back to the border, or else face the sort of sanctions that, for example, could see Russia cut from the SWIFT system. So it's still unclear, but the fact that there are more damaging, certainly very damaging sanctions coming as a result of what's happened already, that much is now certain.
Let's educate people a little bit about what you just said there, Chris. SWIFT, because it is a system that sends payment orders that must be settled by accounts and to institutions around the globe. To cut Russia off of the SWIFT system, that is one of the most extreme things that I guess the West can do as well. Do you see that as potentially damning for the Russian economy, if indeed that does happen?
Oh, sure. There's no question. If that were to happen, then clearly the effect on the Russian economy would be very severe and long-lasting. But of course, also remember, there would be consequences for Europe. And maybe this is something that the Kremlin is also relying on as a factor that it may not happen. Because remember, all of Russia's major energy exports and material exports, most of which go to Europe, but quite a lot goes to the US and other countries as well, they have to be paid for, and they're paid for using the SWIFT system. So while Russia has said that it will not cut off energy supplies, for political reasons, but if those supplies are not paid for, then you may see a disruption of energy going into those markets. So it's a very extreme action that would have consequences, severe consequences for Russia, but clearly would have consequences for Europe and for the global economy if those exports were to be cut. So my guess is we will not see SWIFT as the next response. I think that the cutting Russia from SWIFT will be held back as the kind of last chance saloon sanctions, as it were.
Chris, just exploring that a little bit further, though, in terms of who it would punish. I mean, one of the targeted approaches here is trying to really narrow down on the oligarchs, those around Putin's inner circle. But the conversation around SWIFT is one that's been had openly on markets for a number of weeks now. Surely anyone who wanted to move money around has already moved it around by now.
Oh, yeah. No, I don't think it's a case of, what might happen like today or tomorrow or immediately after SWIFT. As I say, it's more the consequences of Russia not being able to be paid for exports and therefore disrupting those exports. And that's kind of a more medium to long, more medium term, I think, impact. But we are now we're in previously unseen territory with regard to what's happening in the ground, but also this next sanctions move also escalates us into territory that has not been seen with regard to Russia in the past. And as you say, sanctions up to now have targeted oligarchs, have targeted people in the Kremlin's inner circle, senior officials, etc., and really has not had much impact on ordinary people or on the economy. But the sort of sanctions that are now being talked about will definitely have an impact on ordinary people in Russia. There'll be an inflationary impact. There will be some disruptions. There's talk about perhaps banning Russian banks from interacting with the dollar or global system, which means that Russian bank cards won't work in ATMs anywhere else. This moves it into previously unseen territory. And then that asks the question, what will this also now do for internal domestic stability? because Russian people are already showing in the more independent opinion polls that they do not support this sort of action that will impact their lives and disrupt their lives. The generations are changing. So it is something that the Kremlin will have to factor in, not just the kind of immediate sanctions impact, but what does this do for public support for the Kremlin if these additional sanctions start to really impact ordinary people's lives?